Well, hello, friends. My name is Scott Atnip, Texas Impact's Outreach Director, and I want to welcome you to the third and final panel of Texas Impact's Faith and Democracy, Lifting Corpus Christi Voices for Justice. We've had really great panels so far featuring Corpus Christi faith leaders and a conversation about voting here in the great state of Texas. And this panel will be a conversation about policy issues that our planning committee determined were important and priorities for folks in and around Corpus Christi, but I'll go ahead and spoiler alert, they're important priorities for all of Texas. So we'll get that conversation started momentarily, but wanted to let y'all know first that this is the fourth in a series of conversations Texas Impact is hosting throughout Texas this summer and fall, featuring faith and community leaders, advocates, and Texas Impact staff, talking about the importance of Texans of faith participating in the policy process and discussing nuts and bolts strategies for you and your congregation to be effective participants in democracy. This conversation is currently being broadcast on Facebook Live. It'll be posted later in our Weekly Witness podcast feed and on YouTube, where you can also find the panel discussions from our previous Faith and Democracy events. So make sure that you go check out the Texas Impact Weekly Witness podcast feed and our YouTube channel, so you can check out those conversations. Make sure to smash the subscribe button so you can keep up to date with future content. For those unfamiliar with Texas Impact, we are the state's oldest and largest interfaith network, representing the shared social concerns of many of the state's oldest and largest and diverse faith organizations throughout Texas. We are a membership organization, and if today's event inspires you to get more involved, we hope that you'll consider joining. There will be a link to join in the chat section momentarily. Texas Impact exists to put faith into action. We equip faith leaders and their congregations with the information, opportunities, and outreach tools to educate their communities and engage with lawmakers on pressing public policy issues. We help people live out their faith in the public square, moving the faith community from charity to justice. And we all know that communities of faith have a rich history and heritage of service. We engage in direct acts of compassion. We support food pantries. We do all of those charitable works to help the most vulnerable members of our community. And while we recognize our calling to be the hands and feet that serve our neighbors, we also believe that collectively we can make a broader impact by changing public policy. And that's where Texas Impact comes in, equipping and resourcing you and your congregations to do that advocacy and justice work. And while that's important, we want to stress that this fall, we are especially encouraging people of faith and congregations to participate in our Texas Faith Votes campaign, which you can find on our website at texasimpact.org and momentarily in the chat. That campaign has 4 tools for you and your congregation to promote safe, accountable voting, many of which we talked about in the previous panel, but I'll name them quickly. First, we have a checklist for those wanting to ensure a safe, fair election that encourages you to make sure that your registration is up to date, encourages attorneys to get involved in this process, and encourages poll monitors for this election. Second, we encourage people to try to help find election workers, help recruit election workers, especially young, healthy folks, to serve in that capacity this election. Third, we have a pledge to vote based on important values for Texans of faith, including climate, health, immigration, and a rejection of discrimination, some of which we'll talk about in this panel. And finally, we have resources for people who are interested in voting by mail and encouraging others to do the same. So we hope that you'll check out that link in the chat section. Check out how you can participate in democracy this year. I really look forward to this conversation with this panel, and I'm sure that none of these panelists will mind if you go spend a few minutes perusing through the Texas Faith Votes page and sign up to participate in democracy this year. I also want to say a special thanks to all of our sponsors, which you can find on the registration page, and Father Bruce for helping organize our panelists today. Really do appreciate the promotion and work of those sponsoring organizations. Finally, I want to describe the technology for this session. You should see at the bottom of your screen both a chat and a Q&A. feature. We're going to treat the chat area like a water cooler conversation. I will note that you'll have the option of sending it to just the panelists or to the panelists and attendees. If you want everybody to see it, make sure you check that attendees box. We also have a Q&A button at the bottom of the page. Please use that if you have questions for the panelists. We'll try to leave time at the end of this for Q&A today. You can also email me at scott@texasimpact.org if you want to follow up after this event. Finally, please share the content. We mentioned it's in the podcast feed. It'll be on YouTube and it's on Facebook Live. Share using the hashtag TexasFaithVotes, and go ahead and use that hashtag if you have challenges for people or favorite quotes from today. And the last thing I want to say before we start, and something I hope you'll be doing throughout the course of this conversation, is to make a list of people in your life that you want to make sure that you follow up with to ensure they have the resources and a plan to vote. I am guessing that none of the panelists today need that reminder telephone call, but surely there are people in your lives who you can think of who can use that extra motivation. So with that, our final set of panelists for today. We have with us Emily Northrup, the Homeless Outreach Coordinator for the City of Corpus. Emily, thank you so much for being with us. We have with us Beatriz Alvarado, the community organizer with RAICES. Hey, glad you're with us. And finally, joining us for a second straight panel is Josh Houston, who's taking the place of B. Moorhead, our executive director, who had a family emergency today. So Josh, thanks for filling in last minute.
My pleasure.
All right. So Emily, we're going to start with you. And I'm just going to give you all the space to run in this one. We talked about, with the planning committee, of which Beatriz was on, 3 different issues that we wanted to highlight today. And so, Emily, I hope you'll start us out with just kind of a conversation about where we are, what's the current reality of homelessness, and what policy change could Texans of Faith look at to make significant change in that area. We'll start with you.
Sure. So first, thanks so much for having me. I'm just delighted to be a part of this conversation, and I'm delighted to chat with people who want to make an impact. I think one of the things that I truly believe is in the power of everyday people to make big changes. And so I'm really happy to chat with folks who believe that as well. So that's a big question, where we are with homelessness. I think with the reality of COVID-19, we're in a very different place than we were 6 months ago. And so those of us that work in homeless services are, really concerned. Particularly in New Oasis County, we were dealing with an issue, with a significant lack of resources. We live in a county that is chronically undercounted, not only in the census, but in our annual point-in-time counts in which we attempt to enumerate the population of homeless folks in our community. And so when we don't have an accurate count of how many people are experiencing homelessness in our community, it's really hard to plan for effective resource allocation. And so one thing that we are working this year, we're starting our planning is how are we going to count folks in January? And so that's one thing that I can say that Texans of Faith, if you want to get involved, we've got a really big project coming up. January 21st is our annual point in time count. We're looking for volunteers, and this year is going to be a challenge because we're going to have to do it socially distanced. And we're going to have to do it with less funding, less time, and more encumbrance than we're used to. But it is so vitally important that this work is done and that it's done correctly. And so that's my first plug for the pit count. I'm sure I will make several of them throughout the course of this conversation. So what we're seeing is that we're seeing more people entering homelessness. The economic reality is that folks have not returned to work, and there have been moratoriums placed on evictions, but we know that those don't apply to everyone, and we know that they don't apply to communities that have been hardest hit by COVID-19 to begin with. And so we're seeing more folks becoming homeless, and they're turning to services that have fewer resources, whose staffs are stretched thin, who aren't fundraising at the levels that they're normally fundraising, and they're being asked to provide services for more people than they ever have before. And so it's this, we're very concerned that if serious policy change doesn't happen soon, we might be going over a cliff. And I don't know that there is a way back from that. That's easy. And so, the other issue is that many of the people we're seeing that are experiencing homelessness are experiencing it for the first time. And so these are folks that, have never had to turn to an organization for help paying bills, for help with rent, for help putting food on the table. And so, it's not always an easy process, and it's not always an intuitive process to receive assistance. And so sometimes people aren't getting the help that they need and are entitled to until they're in an extreme crisis situation, and then it's harder to respond. And so it's sort of this perfect storm of increased need and decreased capacity to respond to it. And a lot of people that work in homeless services are concerned that if our leaders don't start making bold choices, if we don't start supporting people where they are in their homes now, if we aren't doing intensive homelessness prevention, then this could potentially become a situation that we don't have the resources to deal with at all. And I think, more than that, this isn't a new problem, right? Like we've had homelessness for years, and it's the result of lack of affordable and accessible housing in our communities. And so, because we've not made the investment in that affordable and accessible infrastructure, we're paying for that now because we haven't received the dividends of responsible investment. And so, when you ask me what can Texans of Faith do, I think that there are several things. And I think the first and most important thing is that we need vocal support for affordable and accessible housing in our community. I will say that those that oppose increases in accessible housing are very vocal, and we don't see supporters of increased access to housing showing up at council meetings and making their opinions heard on the way that we do folks on the other side of the fence. And so I think my first suggestion would be to find out about, are there affordable housing developments planned for your community? And if so, get behind them. The way that we end homelessness is through housing. And the only way that we're going to be able to do that is to build more affordable and accessible homes in our community. The other thing that I think that we need to talk about is at the state legislature level, is we're seeing in a lot of local communities across the state is the return of anti-vagrancy laws. And so as homelessness expands and as more strain is put on to communities because the economic recovery has not been equitable across the board, we're seeing some communities start to respond with anti-vagrancy and anti-homeless laws. And we know not only from an anecdotal, but from a statistical standpoint that those don't increase instances of homelessness. All they do is they make recovery out of the cycle of poverty and homelessness more difficult. And so I would encourage Texans of Faith to be very vocal in their opposition to anti-vagrancy laws if you see those pop up on your local agendas. And the other thing I would encourage them to do is to find your local homeless coalition. So every community in Texas has a local homeless coalition, and it's a group of not only service providers and caseworkers, but also advocates and volunteers. Find them and support them in their mission. They usually have monthly meetings. They encourage people who have lived experience of homelessness to share their experience. And that's how local people can get involved into the systems level planning for their community. And so if you're living in Nueces County, we have the Homeless Issues Partnership. It meets the second Tuesday of every month at 11 o'clock via Zoom. I would encourage anyone in the Nueces County area to please join us. My email is emilyn@cctexas.com. Shoot me a line. I'm happy to send you an invitation. And so we plan everything from our annual point in time count. We plan our annual Homeless Remembrance Memorial, several events throughout the year to raise awareness. And we also help volunteers get hooked up with organizations that could use their services. And so that's what I would say is to get involved, watch your local agendas for anti-vagrancy laws, and become an advocate for affordable and accessible housing because that's how we end homelessness in our community. So.
Yeah, I was talking with a friend recently in my community about how there's so much attention to the economy and to coronavirus, but less about what's happening when people fall through those cracks and how we respond. And so that was a really helpful word today. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thanks.
And we'll continue the conversation with you momentarily, but first we're going to turn to Beatriz, who's going to talk to us some about immigration. certainly an issue that has been in the news for a couple of years now.
Yeah, unfortunately, immigrants continue to be political punching bags on so many different fronts, especially under this administration. So thank you so much for giving me the time. So I guess firstly, we can talk within the context of Texas and what political or policy-driven decisions have been made that have directly impacted the immigrant community. So we'll start with SB4, which is a bill that passed in 2017 and became a law. It's known as the Sanctuary Cities or Show Me Your Papers law. It's comparable to Arizona's SB 1070. If you have not heard of that law before, I recommend you to look it up and look up the sheriff in particular that was involved in perpetuating that law and the narrative behind it, and how unsuccessful it was constitutionally to move forward in some ways. So it's been, SB4 has been challenged in the courts, and parts of it have been implemented. So we're basically, it's a very unique fight we have statewide, because we're left with a hyper-local focus on how to lessen the impact of SB4. So I would say in regards to SB4, talk to your representative about their stance on it, right? Did they vote? I mean, everybody voted in along party lines, but I would recommend you have that conversation with your representative. The legislative session is coming up. Can we repeal it? And sorry, I skipped the kind of explanation of what SB4 does, right? So SB4 basically allows police officers on the local level to ask about immigration status. And so this is obviously a very blatant encouragement to officers who, otherwise wouldn't. But now they have the entire state of Texas behind them, giving them the green light to do so. So very important to kind of put that into context when you're talking to your representative, being able to have that conversation about undoing that damage on the state level, because that's been the biggest hindrance for all immigration policy or all immigration advocacy from that point forward. So what I can focus on next is what we're doing on the local level to try to lessen the impact of SB4. So SB4, as I mentioned, has created this, statewide encouragement for police officers to ask about immigration status. It's also created this inability for leaders on the law enforcement side to stop collaborating with ICE and Border Patrol, and so that's a really big one. We're seeing a lot of protests, obviously, but a lot of community discussion around the criminalization of Black and Brown communities, right? And so SB4 has, kind of codified that in some ways. And so on the local level, there are many things we can do. I would recommend you reach out to me. I'll drop in my contact information. We do some advocacy on trying to prevent folks from falling into the arrest and deportation pipeline. So equipping folks with the right tools to interact properly and constitutionally with police officers. But on the local level in Corpus Christi, we also have a very blatant kind of political stance from our sheriff, who is an elected official. He has opted into a partnership with ICE. And so our jail currently is partnered with ICE through the 287G program. And so what we've been doing is educating our community about that program in particular, but also encouraging them to talk to the sheriff about it. And so once I drop my contact information, feel free to reach out. He does have an open door policy, so that gives us an in trying to have these conversations with him particularly. And just to give an idea of what the 287G program is and what it does, it also, similar to SB4, creates this gives kind of the green light for local officials to engage in immigration enforcement, which is not their job. And so very clearly, we can have a conversation with the sheriff about that And also what this partnership has created it's basically given the jail very little ability to be transparent about the impacts. I can speak on the personal level. I filed a public information request to try to understand who was being caught up in this program, and it was denied. And so we're left with very little tools to try to understand the impacts of it. But essentially what it does is it deputizes local law enforcement to act as immigration officials. And so we want to try to understand that on the local level. Talking to the sheriff is one way to do it. He also is open to doing jail tours, so we can also arrange that. So I'll go ahead and drop my contact information in ways we can get in touch to do that on the local level. And really all we're left with is trying to keep our local officials from normalizing this collaboration with ICE, which is an agency that has a growing record of human rights violations. And so in addition to that, I would recommend folks to get informed about the constitutional rights of immigrants and undocumented immigrants, and try to lessen that impact during a potential detainment, or even just a conversation with a police officer that could lead to the questioning about immigration status. I think that's pretty much it.
Appreciate it. Thanks. So the third topic we want to cover, and in part, this was added. Some of you will remember that we had planned on doing an in-person event in March in Corpus Christi, and then canceled it due to the very early stages of coronavirus news. But since then, the committee added the desire to have a conversation about what impact this economic downturn, what impact coronavirus would have on the state budget and particularly healthcare moving forward. So Josh, if you could say a few words about, kind of previewing the Texas legislative session, which will start in January, and the impact that all of this mess might have on the budget and health in particular.
Yeah, so I'd like to start out by giving you a little bit of context that may seem completely unrelated to budget, but is totally related to budget because it has to do with how the session is going to operate. So like everything else in 2020, it's doubtful the unprecedented times, if you will stop on New Year's Day. As much as I would like to get back to times with ample precedent, that seems unlikely. So what we don't know right off the bat is what the legislative session will even look like. No one knows. Lobbyists don't know. Staff don't even know. The legislators themselves don't know. Everyone's talking, rumors abound, but we won't repeat rumors because, frankly, they're taking a very wait-and-see approach and to how the public and even legislators interact with each other. That seems completely unrelated to budget, but yet so many policies and bills pass or fail because of some mundane conversation a lobbyist had with another lobbyist that's a friend of theirs in the grill, the Capitol cafeteria, or in the hallway of the Capitol, or a staffer they bumped into. So there's a real culture to the building. The culture makes it work, and that culture is not possible. So that's going to be really wild and different. At a statewide level, thing number two we don't know is what the state will even look like politically. Now, it won't necessarily be blue. It would be purple. But even Texas becoming purple statewide would be a major, major shift. I've never said this. I've had this job 15 years, and I've said this in March, talking about a primary, what the state might look like politically. I've never said it in November, so that's another unprecedented thing. And the Texas House is legitimately in play, as well as a couple statewide elected officials, not the governor, lieutenant governor, but obviously the U.S. Senate race and then the presidency itself. Let's talk about the Texas House a little bit. We will have a new speaker, period. And with that comes a new leadership team. And that is true whoever's in power. I'm not going to get into gossip hour about what happened to the speaker. You can read about that online. I'm going to talk about things you can't read for yourself. But there will be a new leadership team. And then one of the most powerful chairs is the chair of appropriations that makes the budget. And right now, there is a newly appointed chair who did not serve during the session. And whether that person stays the chair or not is unknown. There haven't really been a lot of interim hearings to even talk about budget. So that is another giant question mark that affects the budget. And then you have the election. So since Reconstruction, I would go back that far, the Texas House has been in control of the moderates. And again, this is analytic. This is not a wish by any means to Texas Impact. We're just analyzing. But the moderate wing of whatever party is in power has been in control of the Texas House for more than 100 years. That's because the whole House elects the speaker, unlike in Congress, where the majority party elects the speaker. So there are at least 3 different scenarios that could play out that would affect who is the speaker and who that leadership team is and who's in charge of the Appropriations Committee. So let's talk about what we do know, because that is some big question marks previewing what comes up after the election, and even then, some great big question marks that still won't be answered, which is unusual. We do know, and this is bad news, that the budget is likely to be terrible. We do not know how terrible, but we have a sneak preview that we're all already falling short by about $5 billion with a B, which is a big number at the state level, even in Texas, of our current budget that they're going to have to figure out how to pay for. So we are a 2-year legislature. We pass the budget. It goes into effect in September, and then it runs for 2 cycles. They're going to have to plug a hole in that current budget just to make the ends meet, and then they're going to have to set the next budget. So that current budget's in trouble. The next budget looks abysmal. It looks a lot like the 2011 session, for those who may remember what that looked like. Maybe even worse, we're not sure. We won't get a really clear picture of it until the comptroller issues an official revenue estimate, and that won't happen until January. So unless there's some serious help from the federal government in the lame duck session, or a new Congress and a new administration to the states, then there's likely to be, without federal help, some really, really big holes in the budget. Epic holes, like when they cut public education in 2011. So when this happens, a lot of lawmakers like to play this fun little game called "What do you want to cut?" And I would just warn you, it's a trap. But here's how the trap goes, right? It is really hard to get people excited over the state budget. In fact, I'm a policy wonk, and when we say state budget, my eyes glaze over. It takes a very special person to be able to get into the minutia of those line items, but it's also a very special person because those line items affect real people. And making dollars, seeing human beings on those dollar signs is often gets hard for lawmakers. And here's what happens when you go in and advocate on the budget. Usually, advocates really care about one part more than the other. And so there's a little divide and conquer game that happens. It says, oh, you're here with a public education group. Okay, your concern's public education. And here comes the divide and conquer. If you don't want me to cut public education, is it okay with you if we cut healthcare? Is it okay with you if we cut this? Well, what if we cut that? What should we cut? That's the trap. That's the game that gets played. And the assumption is that, well, we have to cut something. And I would really urge advocates to push back on that, because that's a choice. There's a revenue side too. And that cutting is the only option is not true. Cutting is a policy choice. And if you really push back on that, then the retort you're likely to get, if people are being honest, is, well, we can't possibly raise taxes. Okay, well, you could. And if it's a super honest conversation, then you'll get to a point where the elected official will say, our voters didn't send us here to do that. Well, there's a truth to that. But you also have to realize what that means is, in a session like we're coming up on, you're not for low taxes, you're for cutting something. Who are you for cutting? And that's the flip you're going to have to make with them intellectually, because they'll want to make it a conversation about not raising taxes. And you have to be ready to make that flip for saying, okay, well, what is it you're for? Who are you for cutting? Because that is where we're at. And I want to be real clear about something. This isn't just one party per se that does this. Texans do not like taxes. So this is what people of faith are going to have to start having a bit of an honest conversation about with ourselves, frankly. If y'all watched the vote on Proposition 4, that was the constitutional amendment we just passed in 2019. That constitutional amendment was to eliminate a provision in our Constitution that said if we ever were to have an income tax, then it would have to buy down your local property taxes and go to public education. And even that scenario wasn't palatable, so it became a political issue where they said, okay, well, do you want to outright prohibit an income tax? And so they eliminated all that language. And so anyway, it became a referendum on, do you want to prohibit the income tax in Texas? And voters in both parties, the margin it passed by clearly indicates that a good number of people in both parties said, we don't ever want to have an income tax. Texans do not like taxes. Some of the last tax increases we saw as a state were in the 1980s and 1990s. And it cost both the Democratic governor, Mark White, and the Republican governor, Bill Clements. Both of them were involved in this exact conversation we're going into. And the option both governors chose and the legislatures at the time chose was, we're not going to cut, or we'll have some cuts, but we will also raise some taxes. And so the legislators that are there today know about those fights and learn from them, because the voters of Texas told them they didn't like that. So my point in going into all that 40-year-old history is that when you ask a legislator to take a tough vote, and this is true on any issue, when you ask a legislator to take a tough vote, you have to be there to support that vote. And what we mean by that is you have to go back home to your communities and be willing to help with the persuasion and help with the explanation. So in this context, that means having an honest conversation about spending and revenue. And for people of faith, that means in our congregations. And until we're willing to do that, then we're stuck in this trap of, so what do you want to cut? But that trap is a choice.
So let me ask all three of you, because I think Texans of faith care deeply about all of the issues that we've talked about so far. What do you hope that they do, right? Like we've talked in some of the previous panels about the fact that it's nice to believe something, right? But at some point we've got to get to work. So Emily, we'll start with you again. What do you hope Texans of faith and those listeners will do when they leave here today?
I hope that they leave here today inspired to advocate. I think that that's really it's the ground game, I think, is what we as advocates for faith and justice and equity, I think that's where we really need to focus most of our efforts, is talking to the people in your networks. There are people that don't place a value, on affordable and accessible housing. There are people that don't place values on that. And there are people that will fall trap just like Josh was talking about, that will say, okay, well, let's cut education or let's cut accessible housing, and you don't have to do it. Budgets are moral documents. We will fund what we value. And so we need to start advocating for our values to be reflected in the budget. Absolutely. I just want to co-sign everything Josh just said. So.
That's usually how I go about my day, is just co-signing everything Josh says. But thank you for that word. Beatriz, what do you hope folks will do?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of work to be done in making these changes politically possible as it's perceived by politicians, right? We're the ones in charge of creating that narrative and perpetuating it in some way for it to become policy, right? So that's a starting point. I think it's been normalized that local agencies can and should collaborate with agencies like ICE and Border Patrol. And so it's our job to push back against that. Otherwise, Black and Brown communities will continue to be criminalized, and it will be justified, right? It will continue to be just another thing we just kind of get used to. We need to bring the voices of those who are directly impacted to the forefront of this work, because they are the ones who are experiencing it, and they're the ones who have the best solutions for really how to transform our communities and not rely on this punitive system that's been part of our DNA for so long. And yeah, I would just recommend you plug into any local organizations that are providing that education around how to build that narrative and to escalate towards really catapulting this change on the local level and ideally down the line on the state level.
Josh?
So number one is to repeat the last panel. I want you to vote. Mm-hmm. Then after you do that most basic and fundamental duty, I think the average citizen gives lobbyists too much power. And I think that leads to some real apathy. And I'm a registered lobbyist, right? Lobbyists are only as powerful as their constituency. And there's two big kinds of constituencies. It's people and it's money. And so one kind of power is obviously money for campaign contributions. But people will prevail over money every single time if, and this is a big if, but it's an important if people are paying attention. And I have seen this over and over and over again, like standardized testing. There was some big, big money involved in trying to have all those standardized tests. And a bunch of moms got mad about how stressed out their kids were coming home from school. And those legislators just told that money interest, I'm sorry, I'll get unelected. And I've seen that on any number of occasions. And I've also seen any number of occasions where people aren't paying attention and don't vote the issue, and big money wins. I say all this to say that in this case, your faith community does have a lobbyist. If you did not know that before today, it's a pleasure to meet you. In fact, there's 3 of us. But we are only as effective as you are engaged as a citizen in your community with your local elected official, with your state rep, with your local folks, with your state senator. And this time around, especially in 2021 with the virus, where it is unlikely we will even be able to get in the building being the Capitol. And if we do, thing number 2 is even if lobbyists in the public is allowed into the Capitol, I really, really, as a former staffer, doubt that a lot of staff or state legislators are going to be very happy to see us coming with the virus, because to take a meeting in person with us is to risk exposure to the virus. So we're going to be doing a lot of this by telephone and by Zoom, just like this. And that is really hard because I can't just walk into the Capitol, walk into a legislative office, and stand in that office until they talk to me, which is one way that building works. I tell you this to say we are really counting on you this next session. So I know Scott has his legislative engagement groups that he is doing and coordinating. Join one of those. It will help foster that relationship with that state representative, because there will come a time where basically what I'm saying is we need to coordinate with you at the local level to be able to make sure that we can get access to the offices we need to get access to get the attention of lawmakers when we need to get it, to get the support and opposition to bills when we need it, to make sure that they know who you are in advance of session. We need that to start right away. Thing number two, and I want to caveat this with, we don't want to tell you how to vote. That's your job. Nevertheless, if you are involved, one good way to get to know your elected official is to be involved in the campaign. Of course, it's a personal choice as to whether or not you want to support or oppose your incumbent. That's up to you. But we absolutely hope that you make a pick, whatever it is, and get involved in that campaign, because that is a great way to get to know them. It is a great way to make sure they know you. And it goes back to what I was saying about supporting the vote. When you have to ask them to take a really tough vote, they need to know that you're going to be there to support it when they do. So I really hope you get involved with your state representative, and we're here to help you do that.
So I'm going to consider that Josh's closing comment. Thank you, Josh, for the time. Beatriz, Emily, either of y'all want to 30-second close us out? Closing thoughts?
Just, thanks so much for the opportunity, and I'm happy to chat about this with anyone that's on the line. My contact information's in the chat box, and if you'd like some help coordinating your impact and how it pertains to homelessness, please reach out, and I'm happy to chat.
Beatriz, anything to add?
Yeah, similar to Emily, my contact information is there. I also forgot to plug, we are releasing scorecards for local elected officials on the topic of immigration, so keep an eye out for those. This is through RAICES Action, which is our C4 arm. So I just wanted to plug that, but thanks again, and yeah, feel free to reach out. I'll be around.
Well, Josh, thank you as always. Beatriz and Emily, it's been great to get to know you in preparing for this panel. Really appreciate the work you're both doing there in Corpus, and look forward to continuing partnerships as we move forward. Beatriz, they're asking for your email in the chat, so if you can knock that out. Friends, thank you so much for tuning in to Faith and Democracy Corpus Christi. Just a reminder, all of this content will be available in our Texas Impact Weekly Witness podcast feed and on YouTube sometime later this week. We really look forward to partnering with you in the weeks and months to come to make sure that all of these policy issues that we've talked about can move forward in a positive way. And in order for that to happen, it's going to take Texans of faith getting involved both in this election, but also in the advocacy work that follows. You've heard some really great tips and strategies for how you can do that. We hope you'll check that out. Let us know if we can partner with you in that work. Again, my email address is scott@texasimpact.org. We'll be happy to talk about ways we can partner. Finally, before we close out, I'll just remind you once again that Texas Impact is a membership organization, and if you appreciate content like this and working with the community of Texans throughout the state to bring about a more just Texas, you can make sure that you and your congregation are members by going to texasimpact.org/join. Friends, it's been fun. We'll look forward to continuing the conversation as we move forward. Until then, let's get to work. Thanks, friends.